Alright kiddos, welcome to your video on evolution, speciation, and extinction. There's a lot of material to go over in this particular video, so I'm going to make sure to get through all of it as quickly as possible, but with the needed detail that you will need for the national exam, so no name checking today. Let's get started. Alright, your first question asks you, what is the name of the amphibian found only in a small area of Costa Rica? That would be the golden toad, as you can see right there, kind of aptly named. What has happened to the organism since its recent discovery? According to the book, it's been extinct. It went extinct 25 years after its discovery. There are some reports of a single toad, though, here and there we've heard of recently, but there's no confirmation that it's anything other than extinct. This is an animal that I will refer back to when we start talking about things like habitat destruction and climate change and the impact of those particular things on a species like this. This is also called an endemic species, which is something that we are going to get to later on in this presentation. Alright, what is the definition of biological evolution? And be sure to specify if the definition applies to individuals or populations. Biological evolution is genetic changes in populations of organisms across generations. It is really key for you to know that evolution is not better, it's just different. And it's more in tune with whatever the conditions are at the current time. So again, evolution refers to populations. What is the name of the process that drives biological evolution? We're going to get to this here momentarily, but that would be natural selection, which is the process by which traits that enhance survival and reproduction are passed on more frequently to future generations than those that do not, thus altering the genetic makeup of populations through time. You have got to get this concept correct. There are a lot of misconceptions about it. Alright, who are the two men who independently proposed the mechanism that drives evolution? That would be Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace. Which of these men is most often given credit for this concept? Wasn't specifically mentioned in the book, but I'm willing to bet you've only heard of Darwin. And this is not in the book. The reason he got the credit is that he published his findings first. Both of these guys did their research about the same time. The reason we mention both of them is that because Alfred Russel Wallace came to the same conclusion as Charles Darwin did, and they were in no way associated, that really lets us know that Darwin got it right. And then his book was called On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, which is really shortened to On the Origin of Species. And where did he travel to gather the evidence cataloged in the book? You can see, went out for 5 years. He was on a boat probably not much bigger than our room and Miss Sikowski's room next door combined in terms of deck space. So he went to survey the South Seas, which is mainly South America and the Galápagos Islands, to collect plants and animals. And it's really on the Galápagos Islands that he observed species that live nowhere else in the world and really developed the theories on natural selection. Here you can see a map of where he went. He essentially circumnavigated the globe. So he went from Great Britain, hugging the coast of South America. Why did they do that? Because there was no GPS, and staying close to land was the best way of making sure that you went in the right direction, and then also you could pop off at any time to get supplies. You may notice they took a little turnaround here at Cape Horn. We're going to discuss this later, but that's because the ocean currents here kind of run in this direction, so you have to kind of loop around until you can find a current that will push you around the Horn of South America. Okay, Darwin's observations. This is not one of your questions, but this will lead you to one of your questions, which is the basic premises of natural selection. As a matter of fact, go ahead and turn to table 5.1 on page 114 of your book. Go ahead and do that. I'll wait. And you're back. Alright, so his observations were most species produce more offspring that can be supported by the environment. Environmental resources are limited. Most populations are stable in size. Individuals vary greatly in their characteristic or their phenotype. If you look around in our classroom, you can see lots of differences in terms of height, body type, eye color, hair color, skin color, the whole 9 yards. And then variation is heritable. This is super important. You may have some unique, super fantastic trait, and that refers to an individual trait, pop up, but if you can't pass it on to your youngins, there's really no point. And he noticed the giant tortoises of the Galapagos Islands and how they had variations in the shape of their shell and the length of their neck, depending on where they were from, but it was very obvious that they came from a single species. So, he made two main conclusions. Species were not created in their present form, but evolved from ancestral species, and he proposed a mechanism. That's natural selection. This is something we're going to spend the rest of this particular video discussing. So, as you can see, again, the wide variety of things that he saw when he was there, everything from Galapagos penguins to marine iguanas to, this is called the magnificent frigate bird. Magnificent is actually a part of its name. Alright, so I'm not going to read this to you, the table, but you really need to know what's there. More things that will kind of help you understand this is individuals in a population with a specific advantage over other individuals, which is referring to a trait, are more likely to survive, reproduce, and have offsprings with that similar trait. Trait becomes more prevalent in future populations. Remember again, evolution happens to a population. A trait is contained in an individual. So, now we're going to get to the first misconception. You need to fix this in your mind. When environmental conditions change, where continents are changed because of plate tectonics, the weather, climate changes, pattern changes happen, availability of food on an island or in an area, maybe there is a new plant that comes in or something suddenly dies off. What happens? Well, one of three things. Organisms can evolve, but they can only do this due to pre-existing mutations. They do not evolve in response to changing conditions. They happen, the organisms that survive happen to be pre-adapted through luck for those changing conditions. Animals can migrate, they can go somewhere else where they better fit into those conditions, or they go extinct. Those are really the only three options. Evolution is not a conscious choice. There's a dude named Lamarck, you don't need to know his name, but he postulated that organisms chose to evolve in response to changes in their environment. And so things like the giraffe wandered into an area with food that was really high, and so over the course of generations, it kept wishing to get to that food. It wanted to get to that food, so it eventually evolved to get to that food. No. The reason we have giraffes is because a genetic mutation allowed for that organism to exist on food it didn't have to compete for, because remember, it lives with things like rhinos that are lower to the ground, rather than wishing to get there. Alright, so that term, survival of the fittest, does not mean the strongest. It means the most suitable to its environment. Butterflies are incredibly fit for their particular environment, but nobody thinks of them as being strong. Alright, so natural selection does have its limits. Genetic change, again, must precede change in the environmental conditions. This is that pre-adaptation I keep going on and on about. Camels, I brought this up in class, I believe. They are a cold climate animal with pre-adaptations for the desert. Feet that can handle shifting land. They have a split hoof that they can go ahead and walk on either shifting snow or sand. The water storage in the fatty tissue in its humps, good for both snowy areas and desert areas. Long eyelashes that keep eyes clear of blowing particles, and so on and so forth. Alright, reproductive capacity. This also influences the pace of natural selection. Organisms that have a low birth rate, like elephants, adapt more slowly than those with a high birth rate, like cockroaches or even bacteria. That's why you don't see changes in organisms with low birth rate very quickly. It also means that animals with low birth rate are really good in times of stability and organisms with a high birth rate are good in times of change. All right, here's a graphic on pre-adaptation. This is explaining how this particular deer herd ended up being predominantly thick furred as opposed to being predominantly or a mix of thick and thin fur. Pre-adaptation for a change. All right, lots of evidence for natural selection. A lot of this is not in your book, so I'm going to skip ahead to the stuff that is. I will go over the rest of this stuff in class. I'll also make sure I film a video so you have it to review. Okay, convergent evolution, not in our book. We're going to talk about it. Biogeography, not in our book. We have discussed fossil records already. It is the strongest evidence that natural selection and evolution has taken place. Now, the records are incomplete. Do know that some forms of life left no fossils, and that current fossil records probably only represent only 1% of all the species that have ever lived. All right, homologous structures, not in our book. There is a recent evolutionary change that we have evidence for. These two folks, Peter and Rosemary Grant, husband and wife, they did a 25-year study of Darwin's finches on the Galápagos Islands. They absolutely watched. This is the same species of bird with different beak types present, and the predominance of a certain beak type reflected the type of seed that was available. These big crushy type beaks were more predominant in years when the seeds of a plant had thicker, stronger shells, and these thinner type guys were more predominant when the seeds had thinner shells. All right, again, the only way that we get new traits in environment, new traits in an organism, is when a mutation takes place. That's it. So, accidental changes in DNA, that's called mutations. These occur through the addition or deletion or substitution of nucleotides, the insertion or deletion of large sections of DNA, and the recombination that takes place during sexual reproduction. Most mutations are harmless, some are deadly, like, say, cancer or albinism, and then others can be beneficial. All mutations are single-generation blips or mild changes in the population rather than evolution unless they, 1, can be passed on to future generations, and 2, make those future generations more reproductively successful so that the trait dominates the entire species. So, in essence, mutation plus natural selection equals evolution. And I hate to tell you this, but mutation does not mean that you're going to get mutant superpowers. How do we know this? It hasn't happened. Okay, that we are now on question 7, by the way, of your reading or your guided learning questions. So, look at figure 5.2 on page 115 of your book for the 3 ways that natural selection takes place, or the 3 trends, I suppose I should say. Please understand what each means for the population. It either preserves what already exists, it moves towards a different dominant feature, or it moves towards 2 different dominant features. Disruptive selection can favor more than 2 traits. The one that is in your book and the one I'm about to show you talks about 2 traits. You can have 3, 4, or 5 being favored depending on what's going on. What will eventually happen if disruptive selection continues? We'll answer that later in the chapter, not in this particular presentation. So again, here are the 3 types of selection. You have directional, diversifying, and stabilizing. Alright, here is an example of directional selection. There's something called a peppered moth, and it has 2 forms, the light form and the dark form. Back before the Industrial Revolution, there's this stuff called lichen, which is a mutualistic relationship between an alga and a fungus covering trees in England. And as you can see, the dark moths, when they landed on this, were and they got picked off by the birds. The light moths were very, very still, and they had no problem staying out of a bird's path, so they were not eaten as much, and the most of the peppered moth population were these light-colored forms. When the Industrial Revolution occurred, the pollution created killed off all the lichen. So all of a sudden, the light-colored moths were, oh my god, and they got picked off by the birds. And now dark-colored moths are the predominant ones, although now that we have new pollution laws in most developed countries, the light-colored moths are staging a comeback. All right, disruptive selection may drive sympatric speciation, which is later in the section. But I want for you to take a look at these two birds. They are the same species. The one on the left is the yellow-shafted northern flicker. The one on the right is the red-shafted northern flicker, and this is because of the underside of their tails and wings. However, also look what's happened. You have this bird has a tan throat and a gray back. This one has a gray throat and a tan back. But more importantly, these mustaches. Black mustache on the left, red mustache on the right. I'm going to talk about why that's such a big deal later on. These are currently, again, still part of the same species. All right, another great reason we know natural selection takes place is that we do it all the time. Artificial selection, we've done it with everything from dogs to cows. There's a reason cows' udders are ginormous. We bred them that way. To different kinds of crops. I'm going to show you a picture here in a second. We can now, though, do something called genetically modifying organisms, and those largely refer to genetic organisms which are a combination of two different species, which is not what artificial selection is. Artificial selection is where you are driving the species towards one type of trait. When we talk about GMOs, it's something entirely different, and we are going to talk about the ethics and the morals and the privacy issues and the harmful effects and who gets to decide if we do this a little bit later on in the school year. All right, here's another example of artificial selection. I bet you didn't know that corn did not always look like corn. Corn used to look like teosinte, which is a grass on the left. You can see a quarter for scale. And over the course of hundreds of, well, probably less than 100 years, you save the seed of the teosinte that had the largest seed pods, and over the course of many decades, you eventually end up with the sweet, sweet corn that we have today. All right, question 8 is, let's see if I have anything else about question 7. Yes, just remember that the mutation has to be pre-existing in order for any of those three things to occur. Remember again that natural selection does not simply weed out unfit individual or traits. It also helps to elaborate or diversify traits that in the long term may help lead to the formation of a new species. In other words, today's mutations are pre-adaptations to unforeseen future changes in the environment. Question 8. What processes have humans used for centuries on livestock and crops that corroborates the process of evolution? We already talked about that. Artificial selection, otherwise known as selective breeding, dog breeds, cow breeds, creation of modern corn. Okay, now we're up to question 9. How are evolution and biodiversity linked? Biodiversity is the result of evolution. All right, differentiate between a species and a population. All organisms that share certain key characteristics and can freely breed with one another to produce fertile, and I repeat, fertile offspring. That is a species. Hybrids are examples of this principle. They are the offspring of two different species but are not fertile themselves. This guy on the left is a mule. It is the offspring of a donkey and a horse. The only way you get more mules is if you breed together a donkey and a horse. Dude on the right is a liger. The reason he looks so funky is because these things don't ever stop growing, and they do eventually die because of that. Their growing doesn't shut down. Again, also sterile. The only way you get a liger is if you get a liger and tiger together and convince them to breed. All right, a species is made up of many populations which are each a cluster of organisms of the same species that live in a particular area. For example, the gray squirrel population here in Fort Myers is the same species as the gray squirrel population in Orlando. All right, this is figure 5.3 in your book, or at least that one looks very similar. What term is used to describe the evolution of many Hawaiian honeycreeper species from one original honeycreeper species? That is adaptive radiation. This is not in your book. Why does this happen? When something called a niche is widely available. In other words, when there's lots of different suddenly available food sources and places to live, organisms will go ahead and adaptively radiate to fill those. A really good example is the mammal came around when dinosaurs were still here, but it was only one or two species of mammals. When the dinosaurs got wiped off the planet, that is when mammals very quickly evolved to fill the spaces that the dinosaurs had left. Not because they were thinking about it, but because mutations, number one, mutations allowed them to, and number two, they just had all those food and places to live that were open, and so they could then survive. They weren't exactly going to be challenging the dinosaurs for places to live and for food. All right, differentiate between allopatric and sympatric speciation. Okay, usually when you have the disruptive selection, where you have different traits that are found equally, what happens if those populations of the same species get separated for a while? You have in each of those different locations different sets of conditions. So that means that different genes become dominant in each population. This is called genetic drift. It's not in your book. We'll discuss it a little bit later in class and also in the supplemental video. At some point, the two populations become different enough that they are two different species. So they essentially drift away from each other. Allopatric speciation is geographic isolation. When different groups of the same population of a species become physically isolated from one another for long periods. Migration, physical barrier, oops, one gets blown onto an island. They drift away from each other because they literally cannot get back together to mate and keep any sort of mutation flowing from population to population. Sympatric speciation arises as a result of reproductive isolation. This is when mutation or natural selection or behavioral changes make separated populations unable to successfully breed with each other, but they are in the same space. So let me give you some examples. Allopatric speciation. Here we have a population of cockroaches that was literally divided in half, and you can see a green mutation popped up in one of them and not in the other. And then at some point they become different enough that they can no longer mate with each other. And here you have populations of fish that are divided into little different areas. You often see this happen with tidal pools. All right, sympatric speciation. Let's say there are two different colors of funky dinosaurs here, and it turns out that they, same color, prefer each other. So after a certain amount of time, even if the blue one fell in love with a green one, they would have no babies because after a certain amount of time they would be so genetically different they could no longer produce offspring. These guys that look like they have bananas on their face, those are called albatross. There are two different species of albatross that live in the same island. They look exactly the same. They never mate with each other though because they have different mating dances, and they are only attracted to each other because of that mating dance. So even at this point, even if they wanted to, they could mate, but they would never produce fertile offspring. And then these guys down here, food preferences eventually created, or not created, but led to two different species. All right, back to our northern flicker. Woodpeckers are, for lack of a better term, turned on by mustaches. So the yellow-shafted flicker, because they've developed this black mustache, lady yellow-shafted northern flickers are only inclined to mate with northern flickers that have a black mustache. Red-shafted northern flickers, ladies of this variety, only like to mate with the dudes who have a red mustache. So they have, these guys were initially separated by development that occurred. One is an East Coast bird, one is a West Coast bird, and all of the development that occurred in the middle of the country really kept them away from each other. After now centuries of them being apart, their genetics are starting to drift away from each other, and we speculated that after a couple more 100 years, they will be genetically different enough that even if they wanted to, they could not produce successful, viable, fertile offspring. So this is speciation in the making right here. All right, genetic drift is not in your book. We will discuss this in class another time. There are specific types of speciation that are not covered in your book. The founder effect, bottleneck effect, adaptive radiation, we've kind of already talked about it, and coevolution. Again, we'll discuss those in class and in a supplemental video. All right, next question on your list is just give two distinct and different purposes in constructing a phylogenic tree. You already know about this. This is the tree of life. You can show relationships. That's among species, among groups of populations, and individuals. How are they similar? How are they different? It also allows you to trace evolution and convergent evolution. Convergent evolution, just really quick, is when totally different species end up with the same sort of outward manifestations, such as the ability for flight. Birds, bats, and bees all can fly. They all have wings. They are not close to being related to each other. And we'll discuss that more in depth in class. All right, here's another example of a phylogenic tree. All right. Oops. No, I do not want to open that file. All right. Here you can see a phylogenic tree that shows you evolutionary hits and misses. The monotremes, I like how it says platypus, etc., when there's only two kinds of monotremes, the platypus and the echidna. They are, despite what Phineas and Ferb may have told you, platypi are not mammals. Not even close. They lay eggs. They're also poisonous. They have little poison sacs in the area around their hind feet and spurs, and they can administer venom through those things. All right. This is what an echidna looks like, by the way. And you can see at some point the dinosaur also kind of didn't have the pre-adaptations to exist through a change we're going to talk about in a little bit. And there's a platypus. Aww. All right, so speciation is one of two processes that determines Earth biodiversity. Name and describe the other one. It's extinction. If you don't have any pre-adaptations to a sudden and catastrophic change in your environment, you go extinct. How does this happen? Large-scale movement of continents, gradual climate change, rapid climate change, and then, as we're seeing in today's world, human influence. All right, what are some good points to extinction? What are some bad points to extinction? It is a value-neutral term. Good points. Quote-unquote, weeds out species not adapted to the environment. It gives new species the ability to fill unoccupied ecological roles or fill newly created ones through evolution or speciation. Again, allowing those new species to emerge and establish. Now, what are some bad points? You lose unique species and genetic material. Possible loss of biodiversity, which means we lose the actual overall number of species goes down. Keystone species, you don't know what those are yet, but they're kind of important dudes. Here is a big problem, premature extinction. This is usually caused by man. This equals low biodiversity with all of its accompanying problems, which we're going to discuss throughout the year. All right, endemic species. Why are endemic species at high risk for extinction? Well, first of all, endemic means a species found in only one small area. Because the population is kind of an all eggs in one basket situation, any small change in conditions can quickly lead to extinction. Their reproductive needs are also specific to the area, so they can't reproduce if things change. Okay, this isn't in your book. What are some other reasons for endemic species to go extinct? Their other needs are very specific too. Food, shelter, and so on. Their adaptations are extremely tailored to that one area. That means that they're a very stable species when conditions may remain constant, and a very unstable species likely to go extinct when things change. From a human perspective, the rarity of the species can make them attractive to humans, which increases the likelihood of their extinction. This is a case, by the way, where you need to memorize at least one endemic species in case that pops up on the national exam. Not only what it is, but where you find it. Giant panda in China. Any of the marsupials in Australia, this is a koala, or the Florida scrub jay. All of these dudes you only find in one tiny place in the world. All right. So, how many mass extinction events have occurred on Earth? That would be 5. Let's see. So, what is mass extinction? It's catastrophic, widespread. There's always background extinction going on, but species usually rise up when a few go away. Mass extinction, we're talking about anywhere from 25 to 95% of every species on the planet going away. This is to give you an idea of geologic timescale. I encourage you to stop here and kind of take a look at it or come back to it if you don't understand what I'm about to talk about. I'm not going to ask you to memorize it, though. The most catastrophic extinction event occurred about 250 million years ago, and it got rid of 75 to 95% of all of the species on the planet. But the most famous one is called the KT event. Why does it have this name? It's because it occurred between the Cretaceous and the Tertiary periods. And it's also when the dinosaurs went belly up and made room for mammals like us. And it happened 65 million years ago. Whenever you see MYA, that means million years ago. This is based on layers, based on scientific evidence found in layers in sedimentary rock, found in Italy. There are two schools of thought as to what happened. And I do encourage you to read the Science Behind the Stories notes in your textbook, which is found on page 122 to 123 in your book. Two prevailing thoughts on this. The first one is that a meteor over 6 miles across hit the Earth, sent up enough ash and particulate matter into the upper atmosphere to reflect the sun's light away, which both reduced plants' ability to photosynthesize and then also dramatically cooled down the Earth. Then there's another theory that it's volcanoes that did this exact same thing instead. A whole massive number of them went off at the same time. By the way, over 6 miles across, if you can run a 10-minute mile, which isn't too shabby, at least not for me, and you were to continually run, you would have to run for a little over an hour before you ran the length of this particular asteroid. All right, how do we know that either the volcano or the asteroid theories are true? We've had 2 volcanic explosions that have provided similar results. This one on the left is Krakatau. When it, I wouldn't say erupted, I'd say freaking exploded in 1883. It not only destroyed most of the island that it was on, it also sent up enough ash into the atmosphere that it cooled the Earth's temperature for years for a little over 2 degrees Fahrenheit. And it caused years and years and years of spectacular sunsets. The reasons that you get those wonderfully colored sunsets is because of air pollution. And there is absolutely lots and lots of particulate matter out in the stratosphere. And then there's also the recent eruption of Mount Pinatubo and gosh, I can't remember which island it is. I'll have to tell you that in class. But anyway, suffice it to say, this happened in the 90s, and it sent up a plume of ash miles and miles high. I want to say 35 miles. And again, global temperatures, because this ash eventually spread worldwide, global temperatures went down a little over a degree for many years. So this is the recent evidence that lets us know that this stuff is not far off base. And because of this sudden and drastic cooling in the Earth's climate, that's why the dinosaurs ended up dying. They were not pre-adapted to survive cooler temperatures because they did not have the ability to self-regulate their body heat. And the main evidence that was found in this rock in Italy was iridium. So levels of that let us know that this happened. And again, when the dinosaurs died, it made way for mammals like us. All right. And why do biologists feel that we are in the midst of another mass extinction? Base extinction levels are up. What events may be contributing to mass extinction? The way humans have quickly changed the landscape and location of resources. We've altered and destroyed habitat. We have hunted and harvested a variety of species, and then we keep moving where species are. And so invasive species end up completely crushing the food chains and food webs of wherever it is that they settle. Why do we care? Because lowered biodiversity means that there are fewer pre-adaptations available for future changes in the environment. Considering that we still really rely on other organisms for our food, it would kind of suck if everything went belly up that we ate. So this brings us to the end of a rather long video. However, this is a super important thing for you to understand how evolution, extinction, and speciation occur as we move forward. So Talk to you guys later. Bye-bye.